Hi, it's Jordan from the Orwell Foundation, the charity which runs the Orwell Youth Prize. The Orwell Youth Prize is an annual programme for students aged 12 to 18 and culminates in a writing prize. The prize and programmes around it introduce young people to the power of political language and provoke them to think critically about the world around them. We've teamed up with Compass to produce a new podcast series where Orwell Youth Prize winners and runners-up discuss the themes emerging from their writing with leading politicians, activists, journalists and thinkers right here on the It's Bloody Complicated feed. From social housing to the power of dystopian fiction, subscribe to It's Bloody Complicated now to hear these urgent new political voices in conversation with the likes of John Harris, Dawn Butler and more. If you would like more information about the Orwell Youth Prize, visit our website at orwellfoundation.com.
Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast that brings you conversations from across the progressive movement. During the show, we speak with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and campaigners about how we come out of these unprecedented times in much better shape than we went in. I'm Frances Foley, your host today and Deputy Director of Compass. Compass is a place where people come together to create the visions, alliances and actions to be the change we wish to see in the world. We're interested in the how of political change as much as the what, and we think conversations like these are a great place to start. Compass members can join the call live and can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to be part of it, go to action.compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, grab your drink of choice and get ready to get complicated. Hello, everybody, and welcome to It's Bloody Complicated. I'm Frances Foley, I'm Deputy Director at Compass. Joining us this week is Polly Mackenzie. Polly is Chief Executive of Demos. I'm sure you've all heard of Demos. And I think Polly was also give us a little bit of a run through her political journey and trajectory and all of the interesting things she's done. And we're here tonight to discuss a series of papers that also Polly has brought out recently concerning one of the foundational questions of us and one of our biggest interests and areas of exploration here at Compass, which is obviously the question of democracy. And we'll get into some of the ins and outs and that and the nuances of it and what this paper throws up. But I'll start as ever with true Compass in-house style by asking Polly. Polly, welcome to the Compass podcast. Where are you and how are you?
Where am I? I'm in Camberwell in South London and I'm very well. I've just had a meeting about our website redesign, which I'm very excited about because our website, I'm afraid to say, is rubbish. And soon that's going to change.
Now, I don't mean to jump on this, but since you mention it, I was reading a very happy blog post today, which rated all of the think tanks in the UK on their logos. And I'm very happy to say we came sixth. We came sixth. So I'm going to take that. I mean, for tiny organisations. Wrong. We deserve more than 63. Our logo's great. Take it up with the designer. I mean, he knew what he was talking about. But yeah, I was very happy to see that. So, do look that up, folks. We came sixth out of 143 think tanks. So
I thought you were a think tank. Are you a think tank?
Well, no, we're not even a think tank, to be fair. But we still made the list because our logo is so outstanding. VAR. Okay, so Polly, before we start, because I think that your papers, in a really interesting way, draw very extensively from the different histories that you had and the different jobs and roles and the kind of journey that you've been on politically. I wonder if you can give us a sense of your political trajectory, especially as you sort of put it in the papers, your journey from technocrat to partisan. And can you explain those terms a little bit to give us a sense of how you're coming at this issue of democracy?
So I wrote this series of papers. They're called Making Democracy Work, which turns out to be a seminal work by Robert Putnam. Oops, never mind. Mine is perhaps less seminal, but nevertheless, I hope a contribution. Trying to work out, I guess, how democracies, and particularly ours, can adapt to this complicated future in the 21st century. Because I think, when I kind of came of age, as it were, and I mentioned in the first paper, having a chunk of the Berlin Wall that my sister had brought home from a Berlin school exchange. I don't even know if it was real, but it felt real to me. And feeling like a kind of child of that Francis Fukuyama end of history era, of feeling like politics is settled. And actually Demos at the time published a book called Life After Politics, which is like just your classic sort of mid to late 90s arrogance of feeling that we had settled that question of how human society should be governed, that the Cold War had been won and we were on the side of good, and it was it. So I guess what I think the last decade in particular has brought into question is whether that's true, whether democracy can and will prevail as the best system of human governance. And I don't mean from a moral or ethical standpoint, but from a practical and pragmatic one, because of course democracy has the capacity to vote itself out of existence, and every form of human society and organization has the power to be destroyed or trampled by its competitors. And Joe Biden on the Capitol on the 6th of January, that's when it was, he talked about, and I think we see this with Russia's behavior in the last few days, he talked about the leaders of Russia and China believing that democracy is a weak form of government and believing that basically they can take us on and they can win. And whether that's expansionist or simply kind of a different form of imperialism that the Chinese might be more interested in, it is the great risk of our age. And that's the sort of the question I wanted to explore. And my view is that if democracies have a competitive advantage as a system of government, it has to come from the demos, from a sense of social coherence and trust. And what I then set out in the paper is that all of the trends of our era are disaggregating that. The way our economy is changing and the way our demographics are changing are putting extraordinary and potentially intolerable pressures on us. And as a result, we have this stuck political system in which big policy issues aren't getting resolved. So then the third paper, you can tell I'm a think tank director, because I'm like, obviously what the world needs is a series of pamphlets by me. In the third paper, right, so then go into technocrats and partisans. This is where I talk about my sort of political journey, is that I fundamentally think that the way we make policy in our democracy is wrong. And it's partly because it's designed for people like me. And I am kind of an arrogant tosser, if I'm honest. And I love being right. I'm definitely one of those people, I think it's a Dr. Phil thing. Do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I'm like, I want to be right. I want to win the argument and that's it. And I love being the kind of the person in the spreadsheets who's figured it out better than everybody else, or who can like do the slam dunk argument. And I remember having and cherishing a book of Schopenhauer's The Art of Always Being Right, which is, kind of taking the piss out of people who need to be right. But also, I love it. And then, of course, I went into government 2010 to 2015. And I think that did shake a lot of the partisan shackles that I had from 5-6 years in the Liberal Democrats as, someone who, I'm the sort of person who cries at like political speeches. Because I remember Charles Kennedy's speech in 2005, really like just welling up and like joining the party. I'm like, I'm sold. Actually cried at a Gordon Brown speech once, but I can totally be captured by that sort of the team dynamic of being with the people you agree with and feeling the sense of moral and intellectual virtue that comes out of believing that you're right. And I then went to government and discovered that the Conservatives weren't as evil as I had said in all those speeches about them, and realized that they might be wrong about things. In fact, they're quite often wrong about things, but very often they are motivated by exactly the same ambitions as progressives might be motivated by. And there are conservatives who are that kind of caricature of being elitist and only caring about rich people getting on. But there are others who just simply profoundly believe that markets and competition are the way that you create the greatest prosperity for the people at the bottom. And that really kind of stripped the blinkers from my eyes, I think, and opened me up to the idea of a non-partisan approach to policymaking. I'm going to get to the end of the spiel soon, I promise. But I then talk about giving up on being a technocrat. And for me, a technocrat is that person who just loves spreadsheets in a way. I think, policy making is really complicated and it's difficult trying to decide precisely what to do. And you can see that from this kind of growing network of what works centres that do these kind of long evidence studies about precisely what needs to happen in our society. But the problem is, it happens in politics all the time, is you get the clever people in a room to figure out the right thing to do. And then the communications people come in, or the political director, and they're like, you can't do that, it's really unpopular. So what happens is you just get stuck. And we see that you see it on social care reform, and you see it on drugs reform and prison reform and school reform. Everywhere you look, you've got some clever people who say that they know, they're absolutely sure what's right, but the public don't believe them. And so we either get stuck, or you take an approach, sort of Dominic Cummings actually, I think, has written about this, the idea that what you do is you win a majority by saying one bunch of things. Then you get into office and you do the stuff that you know is important. You basically hope nobody will notice and that they'll be grateful later. And I think what we discovered with Brexit in particular, but a lot of the sort of the political movement that progressives are suffering under, is that people aren't grateful. They're just not. If I think of where I grew up in kind of rural Wales, voted heavily for Brexit, despite the fact that it has been the recipient of billions and billions in, first of all, EU farming subsidies, but also big infrastructure investments. And the answer when you talk to those farmers is, you didn't ask us. You didn't ask us what we wanted. And I think that we've just assumed that if you get the right answer by doing your return on investment analysis best, that people will somehow understand, and that they are marginally better off than a counterfactual they never experienced. I think we've discovered that you have to, in fact, involve people in decision making. So what I've set out is, and we're trying to articulate and make kind of core to our being at Demos, is what I'm calling humble policymaking, where arrogant tossers like me, instead of thinking that the job of the policymaker is to figure out what's best and impose it on people, is that actually the job of the policymaker is to convene people, participants, members of the public. And it's hard work for members of the public, right? This is not pretending that democracy is easy, to get people to stop outsourcing their decisions and actually take part. And I lean into the analysis of one of my predecessors at Demos, Tom Bentley, who talked about everyday democracy. Because the reality is when participation is limited to a single ballot sort of vote in the ballot box and done exclusively by elite institutions miles and miles away from people's everyday lives, people aren't going to want to get involved. And it's one of the really important parts of devolution, is you have to get decisions down to the level where people want to get involved and they can comprehend the complexity. If you take complexity away from people and all you do is promise them simplistic answers to difficult problems, you take policy further and further away from people. You create more and more of a democratic deficit, and that is where populism thrives. And that's where we're stuck. And I think that technocrats, the technocratic progressives and the Nigel Farages of this world actually have one sort of shared belief, which is that people's worst instincts are really what drives them. And Nigel Farage wants to live off that, exploit that. The technocrat is that if you put people in control, they will follow their worst instincts. And that's why in the end, you just need to sort of shuffle it away from people and do government for the people, not government by the people. And that's the reality of what needs to change.
100%. I think there's so much in there. So firstly, I want to start with this area of also where we strongly disagree. So the reason I loved these papers, and particularly actually my favorite was the humble policymaker, because it kind of nails this question of decline of democratic faith. And I would go further than what you said, which is it's not just technocrats. I think this was a problem actually across the progressive left in the wake of Brexit. And I understand that this was in a really emotive time, but you talk very powerfully in the paper about, the day after Brexit, reading your friend's Facebook post. And I had the exact same experience. And my main reaction was sort of horror. and I knew that it was an emotive day, and I knew that this was kind of strongly held beliefs coming out in a way that was actually quite ugly. But what it betrayed to me was this, exactly what you're saying, is that large numbers of the population, or people whose values I otherwise shared, felt that actually millions of people in this country were sort of secretly, terrible, bigoted people. And I think there's a lot to be said about Brexit. But to me, that was the horror of it all, was actually this sort of exposing, I would say, of a sort of a lack of democratic faith. And by that, I don't necessarily mean faith in democracy. I mean faith in the capacity, the goodwill and the intelligence of their fellow citizens. And that is what sort of struck me more than anything in the wake of Brexit, on both sides, on all sides of the argument. And so I wanted to ask you where you think this springs from, and if you also think it's got worse during the time that you've been in politics, or actually is it just more understood and more highlighted?
So I think it's definitely got worse. But let me start with this sort of the fundamental point, right? So, and I'm deeply traumatized by the Brexit referendum, like I'm sure most of the people on this call. And I went to IKEA to find, I had meatballs just to make myself feel European. So I share that sense of what the hell has happened. But the first thing is that a democracy is a democracy, and you can believe that people who agree with you should be in charge, or you should believe that the public should be in charge. And it's really uncomfortable, because in any group of people, right, half of them are going to be below average intelligence, and half of them are going to be below average kindness. And that's the nature of maths. And it's a problem. And I can understand why some people might therefore conclude that democracy is really not a very good system of government. I don't come to that conclusion, because I don't frankly see how there's an alternative that isn't revolutionary and authoritarian, and, but nevertheless, it is uncomfortable. You have to, I think, lean into the discomfort of it, is that being in a democracy means sharing decision-making power with people you disagree with, and lots of them. There isn't an alternative. The question really is, how do you build a society where we can make decisions together? And there's a lot that we have wrong with our democracy at the moment. And clearly, referendums are largely stupid, but even more clearly, referendums on ill-defined questions with no parameters are the worst of all worlds. It is awful that we got backed into this position of having to do something so stupid because of a poorly designed referendum structure. But nevertheless, we are what we are. You have to go forward. I think that there's lots of research about this, and polarization is, thank God, nowhere near as bad as it is in the United States. But there is polarization. And I think it's also, we did work on this around both Brexit and around COVID restrictions. COVID restrictions, mass opinion is pro, so slightly different. But what is a parallel is that the people on the pro-COVID restriction side and the progressive side have a much lower opinion of their opposing group than that opposing group has of them. So the Leavers don't hate Remainers anywhere near as much as Remainers hate Leavers. It might be because they won, but it's also because it's a real feature of the progressive left, I think, to assume that the other guys are just inherently evil, rather than either wrong or different. And the right are actually better at being liberal-minded and open to disagreement.
So I wanted to come up on that exact point, because I did think that while I was reading the papers, I did wonder whether this question about technocracy, it's hard to talk about technocracy, right, without coming to this point. Actually, a lot of these questions are around class, it seems to me. And I read in the wake of Brexit, and also in the wake of Trump, I read a number of really thoughtful pieces about this, and it was related to this question of also, you mentioned the piece Gove's thing about that people have fed up of experts. And I think that's what's so interesting, because if you reframe that, you can understand how when people on the left talk about agency and democracy, that it also relates to this question of having power over your own life and not feeling like you're being talked down to. And I think the point you just made is really relevant to this question of technocracy, because it seems to me that there's this great Tim Wise quote, which is, you can't organize people if you don't love them. And I think there's something also in the Brexit, something in the wake of Brexit that made me feel that the question of democratic disaffection was also related to this question of a lot of working class people. It was the most class correlated vote in recent UK history. have the experience of constantly being talked down to. So you've got this, their doctors telling them they're overweight and should eat better. They've got, their teachers telling them at parents' evening that their kids, need to be better educated. And you've got their divorce lawyer judging them. And I think this question of judgment is a really strong thing in politics. And technocracy feels like that to some people. It feels like being done to and being told that you can't make decisions about your own life because you don't really understand. And that is really powerful. It's a really, powerful feeling of humiliation, I think, and disaffection. And I just wondered whether you thought that was part of the story. I mean, I know that it can be sometimes getting into quite difficult territory to just frame it all in those terms, but it definitely felt like something that was at play to me in and around Brexit and around Trump.
Just so the couple of people who said in the chat, like, right-wing people are horrible to me, or words to that effect, or that can't possibly be true. And two things. First of all, Twitter is not life. And you've got a sampling bias if you engage with anybody on Twitter, is that there are awful people on the internet. And it's certainly true that there are lots of hateful, intolerant, abusive, bigoted, unacceptable right-wing people who make progressive lives miserable. No question. But I'm talking about when you do a representative sample of all of the people across the public and people with those that, again, it's really basically Leavers hate Remainers half as much as Remainers hate Leavers. But that doesn't mean that some people aren't abusive. They're two different facts, and abuse on the internet is a whole other thing. So what was your point? I got distracted by the comments and class. So as you can tell, I'm like, I'm from rural Wales. You can tell by my accent. Class is a really complicated thing in the UK, but I think it's definitely just a basic fact of human existence that happiness comes from a sense of self-actualization and being, and it actually, clearly there's a class dynamic to that, or any kind of cross-cultural barrier of being told what to do by people who are different from you, especially if they think that they are superior. And I think so we're doing some work with an amazing woman called Susan Allen at the moment, who is researching the neurology of power. And actually, the less power you have, the more empathy you have. And the more power you have, the less empathy you have. And it's actually like you can see it on scanners. It's there, it's happening in the brain. I think that's a real, it's a problem on both sides, because when you have power, you're less likely to understand other people's dynamics and feelings in interacting with you. When you don't have power, you become hyper aware of judgments that others you think are making of you, but they're probably not, because actually they don't give a damn about you. And I think we really need to unpack that if we're to be able to build better interactions between people of all different backgrounds. But the fundamental point is that being told what to do by other people, being told what's best for you by other people, is alienating. And you have to involve people in the decision. So I tell the story in my pamphlet about when I was at this really shit hotel in Bulgaria, and my husband went up to get pudding from the buffet for me. He came back literally with a moldy orange. And I did not believe him when he said that was the best thing they had. I had to go up and look for myself. And this is the love of my life. And I still couldn't trust him. So how are you going to trust some bunch of wankers in Westminster to decide what's best for you in Burnley or whatever it might be, if essentially what you're getting is this moldy orange? You have to involve people in the decision, partly because you'll get better decisions, but also because then you trigger people's confirmation bias instead of all of that neurological stuff that's going on about power. And they feel like, if people feel invested in decisions they've been part of, and you see that through all of the work that's being done by like local trust and kind of on community power, is that people are capable of extraordinary things if you trust them and give them power. But some of those decisions they might make might not be the best thing according to a return on investment analysis in line with the green book that the Treasury has. And I think we need to get comfortable with that the right decision for people might come with all sorts of kind of social capital benefits or happiness benefits that you actually can't measure with your standard cost benefit slide rule.
Yeah, so I thought that was a really interesting point. And in fact, I thought it might have even been, I mean, the story was the story, so you couldn't really change the moldy orange, which I loved. But I also was more interested, I was like, you could make this argument even more powerful by him choosing something you actually do want. but you still needing to go back. You might think, okay, I actually do want this as an appealing trifle, but I still want to look at the options.
Okay, trifle. What? Surely we can
I'm
agree.
sorry.
Trifle should be banned.
Trifle is an excellent dessert, and I will die on this hill.
No.
A trifle-shaped hill.
No.
Okay. Insert other desserts are available. Insert dessert of choice.
Whatever I choose, you're going to be like, you're so posh. Anyway.
Trifle, classic. I thought it was just appealing to everybody because it's got something for everyone in there. But maybe you don't like the mush. Accomplice. We just like all the mush of different.
Oh yes, eaten mess.
Yeah.
A lot to be said for eaten mess.
Oh Lord. Oh,
no, too sweet.
I mean, yeah. We can get into
I basically
it,
just don't like custard. I would cross the road to avoid custard.
I mean, my mum does an upmarket version where she makes it with mascarpone, and I think that's the most middle class thing she's ever done in her life. Anyway, so I thought they would be more powerful if it was something you even actually do want, but you have to be actively involved in the choosing. I think we all know that feeling of feeling like, I don't want this thing foisted upon me. And one of my favourite lines in the piece was, participation has value even if it didn't make the decision better. And I think that's what you're getting at. And in a way, you could even go further than that and say the participation is part of the intrinsic good that this process is aiming at, right? So you could say that actually it's not just about the fact that, there was a correct answer and you didn't get there. Part of the correctness of the answer was that you were involved in making it. But I really wanted to ask you about this particular thing, because it does seem to me, and from what you've said and from talking to friends who work in the civil service and other parts of sort of technocratic bureaucracy say, is that this is so countercultural, which is part of the reason, you wrote the paper. But how do you even go about framing this in terms of reconceptualizing what the correct thing is? Because I think that is so fundamental to making a better democracy and to ultimately shifting those people in power to perhaps also, to your previous point, have more empathy with people who don't have power.
So I try to differentiate between discovery questions and agreement questions. So, if I ask you what 2 + 2 is, like, there is an answer, it's 4. And if you didn't know, we could look it up. But if I asked you what what color the compass logo should be, because obviously it's clearly not good enough. But anyway, don't know.
Neon blue. The people have spoken. It's neon blue, apparently. I didn't know it was neon, but
the point, actually, what matters around the compass logo is the feeling of connection that its members have to it. And so it could be really successful as a blue logo, but it'll also be really successful as green logo. And in the end, what matters is what we can agree on. And
we have pink as well, just telling you the full range of options for all of our.
I'm very glad. But essentially, and I think what policymakers have always understood, right? There's those two different kinds of things. It's only the logo, colour, fine, whatever. But is that actually there's huge numbers of policy issues that you might think are right or wrong discovery questions that aren't. Now, exactly how to manage load on the national grid with competing different energy sources, right? Like, that's a technical, mathsy question that you don't want to involve the public in, right? But that doesn't mean that how you design the welfare system is a discovery question, because there actually isn't a right way to design a welfare system. I think that a welfare system is an act of solidarity between those in need at any particular moment and those who are paying, though some people obviously maybe both at any one time, and most people will be over the course of their lifetime. And actually, public consent for that system, built through participation or not, but it's an intrinsic factor in whether it's a good welfare system or not. Because if people feel that the welfare system is for people like them and it works and is fair, they will pay for it. They will feel entitled to claim it instead of feeling that there is stigma attached to it. So actually you realize that thinking there's all sorts of topics which people want to sort of put into a what works center and ask to be figured out for them. Actually, in the end, what matters is what we can agree on. And I think we need to push way more of our policy issues into that camp, recognizing that therefore the precise nature of the technical answer is is less important than what we can agree on. And the problem, of course, is that we includes stupid, mean people, as well as nice, clever, thoughtful people. But again, because the stupid and the mean have to contribute in a society and play by the rules and follow the laws and do what the police say or whatever it is, actually their participation and involvement is an intrinsic success factor for a welfare system or a housing system or a pathway to net zero. And that's why you need to have kind of mass levels of participation, radical devolution to levels where people can and should get involved. Just to come back to your point, it's something that totally twigged for me from this old Everyday Democracy piece by Tom Bentley, 2005, I think, is that if you make the decision about something, about the design of a park or the design of the welfare system, is that there's an opportunity cost from the people not getting involved. Because when people get involved, it changes the people. It builds up what Tom talks about as a democratic skill set. And every time a clever civil servant or a policy expert makes a decision on somebody's behalf, there is an opportunity cost, because the democratic skill set, the learning to compromise, the learning about the complexity, the relational skills of engaging with other people in your local area, none of that's done. So if you design the park, you might end up with the exact same park than if a community gets together to design a park. But the feelings that people have about each other and the feelings they have about the park are different. And that creates social value. And so every time you make the decision, you're actively destroying social value. And if you think about it that way, I think you can start to make the case for shifting the default. Because again, another human bias, loss aversion. So let's flip it. Let's talk about the opportunity cost. Let's talk about the social value that's being destroyed by technocratic policymaking.
And I would argue even worse than that, because you're also taking a decision away from people, and that itself feels bad. Everyone knows what it means. It's like, oh, don't bother, I'll just do it anyway. That also feels bad. So it's not even just the lost opportunity, it's this other thing of like, I don't trust you to make the decision, which is what implicitly technocracy tells us. I have two more questions for you, Polly. And the first one relates exactly to what you were just saying. And the second one picks up on a different part of the paper. So my first question is, okay, so let's bring politicians back into this. So I'm a massive fan of citizen assemblies. I'm a big fan of deliberative democracy, and I'm a big fan of also neighbourhood democracy and these questions of involving people. But what role is there for the politicians in all of this in terms of not doing political short-circuiting? So this thing about actually being upfront about the tough decisions, talking about trade-offs, talking openly about the complexity of things. Obviously, none of this is easy. By definition, talking about complexity is pretty tough. But do you worry also about the space for politicians to be doing this, and that politicians actually might become more brittle? And, I would also invite you to kind of reflect on the experience of Lib Dems in government in that respect, which you bring up in the paper, of this question of actually when people do that, they often get punished. So is it worth individually politicians doing this? And as a secondary question, what do we all do to make a culture more amenable to politicians being honest and upfront about the challenges and prioritizations involved in doing politics at all?
So I also tell the story about the very first day I had working in politics, 2004, when my new boss, Rob Blackie, told me, the thing you need to know about politics is it's not like the airline industry. Okay, like in the airline industry, everyone knows that you could get market share off the other guys by attacking their safety record. But nobody does it because they know that you would damage the whole airline industry, and flight drivers start talking about safety because you trigger people into thinking about whether flights are safe at all. So you get market share, but you shrink the market. And there is nothing, so nobody does it. In politics, there is no such self-denying ordinance. People will absolutely destroy the brand value of politics for the sake of a tiny chunk of market share. And they've been doing it for years, and they're killing themselves. And it's true, right? And there's a sort of game theory problem here, is that fundamentally the people who try to do it differently are the ones who lose, because complexity versus simplicity. My view is that if we carry on like that, the consequences are that Vladimir Putin is right, and democracy is a weak system of government, and we can't manage We can't manage the fact that our population is getting older and that we've like trashed the environment and need to adapt our economy. And we can't manage regulating technology. And we certainly can't manage keeping our borders safe or protecting the territorial integrity of democracies. And that's a problem. So it's really tough, and it requires essentially some sort of mindset shift from politicians to play the long game instead of the short game. Whether it's possible for them to genuinely take that leap and stop destroying each other for the sake of a tactical win, I genuinely don't know, but I hope. And because I think most politicians actually, they're not that evil. They're trying to do the right thing. There are some notable exceptions. I think probably our Prime Minister is one of them. But all of the dynamics of this are really difficult. And I genuinely find myself at a loss as to what you do about it, really, other than try and advocate for better ideas and better ways of doing things. Because it's like PR. Obviously, it's a better system of democracy, right? But the only people who can introduce it are people who've won under first past the post. So why are they ever going to do it? And that's a problem. I know what here looks like, and I know what there looks like, and I would love the ideas of others on how we get there. And somebody's just said a written constitution. I agree. But again, to get there, you need, the only people who can do it are people who are willing to essentially to get power and instantly give it away. And when our political dynamics, and I think Isabel Hardman's book is really good on this, Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, but all of the dynamics are basically to elevate peculiar sociopaths to the top of our political parties, and particularly into prime ministerial office. So I don't know. Well, you're going to fix it.
One answer
right?
Could be, yeah, join Compass. We're trying to build that exact. There we go. Not that I teed you up for that at all. Yeah, but I mean, building the public pressure to say that we care not just about getting progressive politicians elected, but those that care about strengthening, expanding, evolving our democracy is basically what Compass is trying to do with Progressive Alliance and with all the other kinds of work that we're doing around democratic reform in the Labour Party and promoting citizen assemblies. And because in order to do all of the other stuff, especially around the biggest question of our time, the climate crisis, this is the one, guys. We need all of the the best democratic muscle that we can build over this period, and we need politicians who are rewarded for enhancing that and standing up for it.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. It's Bloody Complicated is brought to you by Compass and is made possible by the support of our amazing members, like Clive. Here's Clive on why he joined the Compass community.
My name's Clive Lewis. I'm a Labour MP for Norwich South. I've been involved with Compass for 7 years or more and a member for a few years now. My involvement with Compass first started because it was the first left-wing organisation I saw that was really pushing forward the environmental agenda. This was years ahead of anything that was being talked about in Labour at the time, and I thought it was fantastic. I keep supporting Compass today because it's a refuge, in a political environment which, to be quite frank, is extremely tribal, it's extremely difficult. It's the culture of Compass. It's about asking difficult questions and acknowledging that there will be differences, but actually those differences are a strength, not a weakness. You can be in any faction of the Labour Party or any faction of the Green Party or the Liberal Democrats or any other progressive organisation or in no political party, just someone who's interested in the world around them and wants to see the world change for the better. It's where I get my political sustenance from, and it means a lot to me to be a part of that community, and that's why I would wholeheartedly endorse it to you.
Find out more about joining the Compass community at compassonline.org.uk/podcast. And now, back to the conversation.
We've got some cracking questions, and I'm keen to not eat too much into questioners' time. So, Samuel, I know that you've got a few questions lined up. Should we get the first three in there? Do you want to bring in, who we got first? Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Okay, so how do we logistically get to a place where we have a participatory democracy where all people feel enfranchised and engaged? But I think actually what I meant was, what does it look like? Rather than how we get there. Is it citizens' assemblies? Is it regional devolution, and if so, to what level? Is it PR? Is it media reform? What does it look like basically? And how do we make it robust? How do we stop it being gamed by rich, powerful people?
Wow, that's a biggie to start off with. We love it. A bit of everything, a bit of the what and a bit of the how. Andy, we've got you up next. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I've got, how do we get politicians to explain that they might not have all the answers? And to coin a phrase, it's bloody complicated. And therefore that compromise is not a sign of weakness, but wisdom.
Yeah, I think this is very much what we were just touching on. But Polly, if you could come up with some really snappy, answer to that, I'll give you a few seconds to be thinking about it. And finally, in this round, Alex. Hi, Alex, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi there, Polly. Thanks. You covered a lot of ground there. There's loads we could follow up on. But my question relates to the idea you touched on a couple of times that Russia and China view democracy as a weak form of government. But don't you think that our government is actually just a weak form of dictatorship? We hand a lot too much power to the person at the top, and the person at the top appoints the people around them, and then their job just becomes to protect the person at the top. So I'd just like to comment on that idea, whether you think our democracy is just a weak form of dictatorship.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. And should we just get Catherine in as well?
Giving that bottom-up participatory democracy, however we want to phrase it, extends both the size of participation, commitment to it, but also a sense of validity, that people are less likely to be thinking, oh, what's the point, because they're all the same, etc., etc. And the breadth of views, because some Mandarin or politician is not actually dictating policy to us, is bottom-up and enablement not only an extension of the democratic ideal principle, but also a protection against its destruction, because you've got a wider, deeper, firmer foundation?
I think that's a great question, Catherine. And the idea that people who, just back to the park, right? In a way, if you helped design and build even this park, you're more likely to fight for it if people are destroying it and vandalizing it. And the same is true, arguably, of our democracy. So a great bunch of questions there, Polly. Which do you want to take and in what order?
Well, I think they're all kind of linked, or maybe I'm just not doing justice in my notes. But so, what does it look like is a bit that, this society where everyone feels enfranchised is kind of the answer given as the last question. Is it requires much more participation. I don't know if we're going to get to a 4-day week of our working lives, but if we do, I'd like the 5th day to be public service of being involved in decisions, right? Like, it's hard work. I think we've kind of lied about democracy. And I share the skepticism that we have this sort of like perfect democracy. Of course, I mean, democracy up to a point is always going to be some kind of tyranny of the majority. And I think that the constitutional protections of a liberal democracy and the rule of law are just as important as the democratic part, but that's probably another set of conversations. But we have to radically reform democracy if it is to thrive, but also survive, in my view. And that's what this looks like. It looks complicated, actually, and difficult and hard work. But we've done this awful thing. If you look at the way elections are run, essentially the promise that's now made in these like hyper-personalized adverts is that it's democracy as a consumer transaction about you getting what you want. Democracy can never be that. Democracy is always about what we choose, not what I want. And that's a kind of really, really fundamental insight. How do you get politicians to explain that instead of promising you the moon on a stick if you just vote for them? Genuinely, it's difficult. It's asking them to take a leap and be different. And I think the political pressure that they face from their parties is going to be fundamental to securing that. I don't really like internal party democracy because I think it mostly pushes people away from moderation in quite harmful ways. But if we're going to have it, then fine, we just need to mobilize within political parties to get them to put pressure on their leaders for the right kind of things. And that is essentially what Compass is trying to do, rather than other bodies which are then working within exclusively the Labour Party to pull it back to the left.
And just one more point to add on that, I think that question of it's not just the voter as consumer, it's also not just the aggregated amount of individual vote, which is essentially what an election is. Like, a move to a more participatory democracy is one where people's views are changed as part of that program. And I think a lot about these questions about leadership and movement have within them strong, active, traveling verbs. People are moving in that, leading people away from something and moving people towards something. And that's the point of a democracy. And this is, a little bit to take issue. I saw what you were saying in the paper about people being very harsh on focus groups, as if it was, terrible to do a cross-section of the population, ask them what they think. But I think some of the criticism of focus groups is valid, right? Because it's just people who show up and give their views, and they don't necessarily go anywhere. There's also no accountability to them. They're not necessarily involved in the decision. They just show up and go their views and get paid their money. And I've been part of a focus group, and you go home, but you don't. It's so different from a citizen assembly where you're actively making the decision, and also people will push back and change your mind. And I think that's a big part of that. Sorry to jump in.
Of course. I mean, I think leadership is fundamentally important. And in as much as I have an answer, it's an impossible one, which is Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert guy, most trusted man in the country. If there's anyone in the world who can explain complexity to people, it's him, actually. And if he would only just bloody found a political party, we would have some hope. Unfortunately, he won't do it because, you know what, like, we have a political system which is just asks too much of people, actually, that no decent people want to get involved. You just end up with, I don't know, not exclusively, of course, there are some good politicians in all of the parties, but nevertheless, the dynamics are pushing more and more brilliant people away from politics and more rubbish people to the top of politics.
Great stuff. All right, I think we've got the next round of questioners in. So we've got Martin and Adrian. Martin, I think you're up next. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, hi. This is Martin in London. Thanks very much. I've been nodding along to a lot of what I've heard, but I think I heard you say something very early on about all of the trends in our era diminishing trust, etc., or something along those lines. And I'm wondering, I try to be a glass half full kind of person. I'm wondering, are there really no counter trends?
Great, and we'll get one more question. I do like that question, Martin, because yeah, it can be very dark. We can begin to, oh, woe is me, the shroud raising stuff. And I think especially in democracy space, there's a lot of really interesting innovation going on. I think Polly will know a lot about that as well. Adrian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Francis, and thanks, Polly, for an amazingly insightful 40 minutes or so. It's been really good. I think my question, and I'm a town councillor for my sins, but I think that's where we do get very good decision making. One of the things that I feel is we've got this problem in getting people comfortable in making difficult, nuanced decisions when they're relentlessly sold simple black and white options and sound bites. And I'm no huge fan of Keir Starmer, but this sort of 3-word soundbite that he's trying to trot out about respect and royalty or whatever the hell it is, it just plays into that sort of narrative that he's just not good at. How do we change the page to a different form of discussion?
Polly might have something to say about that, because I think I spied a blog from you about just
this
exact speech when I was stalking you for this. Shows I've done my research too. Just throwing that in there.
So you have to win the game on the existing rules before you have the right to change the rules. So I think for my sins, I actually quite liked those the words that he's chosen for a range of reasons that I can't actually remember now, but I wrote a blog about it, so we should look that up. But if you're competing with like the Get Brexit Done guy, you've got to play the game. And I think we have to get a little bit comfortable with that. That doesn't mean to say that Keir Starmer couldn't be more exciting, or that his policy platform couldn't be more creative, or plenty of stuff to say about the Labour Party's agenda. But they are now being informed, I think, by better research. And I think this question about respect is foundationally important. It's a recognition of what's called relational egalitarianism, that actually, I think there's very low interest in this country for total socioeconomic egalitarianism, the idea that everyone should sort of have the same amount of money. But there's really strong enthusiasm for relational egalitarianism, that just because you've got a bit more cash than me doesn't mean you get to talk down to me or think that my life is less valuable or less worthwhile than yours. And I think that's a dynamic that they are now exploring. What does that look like in policy terms? I don't know. They haven't got an agenda for government. There's a lot of work to do, but let's not be too dismissive too quickly. Then on the point about trends and counter trends, it absolutely, Francis is right. Actually, this trend in democratic innovation is really exciting. It just comes with a competing trend in democratic populism. And I feel like actually the whole of Europe is going through a sort of experimental period of trying both of these things out. You see the Paris Citizens Assembly, and then you see Fidesz. And who's going to win? Because we know that populism is a crappy form of government that's going to lead to bad decisions and like economic harm, and then we lose. So I really hope that the democratic innovations prevail. But what I set out in the paper's called Living in the Exponential Age, is there's so many of these trends which are disaggregating social connection, and particularly the way our economy is becoming more personalized, partly because of technology and technological capabilities, the way our advertising and our media environments are shifting. And I set out, like, I've got 15 of them, right? And you can't stop those things. It's one of those, Canute-like, right? You cannot stop the tide. What you can do is recognize that when the dynamics of a society change, you need a different form of government. And so what I then put in my final paper, which is called The Gravitational State, is that we haven't needed a state that acted as a gravitational force to pull its citizens together, particularly in the past. If you've got a relatively demographically homogenous society where most people live quite close to where they are and consume the same kind of media, go to the same kind of church, your need to have an activist state in terms of building social capital is pretty limited. If you want to have a really diverse society with 5 generations alive for the first time in history, with lots of migration, with totally diverse economic experiences, individual consumer price, if you're going to have all of that, okay, you need to have a gravitational state to pull people back together. And it's just about keeping up with modernity. And people think that's not the role of the state. The role of the state is to keep people safe. Well, maybe in the 21st century, the role of the state is different to the role of the state in the 19th century. We should be okay with that, but we need to be constantly adapting and modernizing our democracy. Constitutions that are kind of across Europe, not that we have got one, but were basically written as our democracies were formed 100 to 150 years ago. Like, what else that was written down 150 years ago is still any good? Only literature, in my view. Excellent. So I think we've got time to squeeze in one tiny final question. And there's been a raging debate in the chat about which one it should be. The polls, it was a 2-horse race. Sorry, I'm banned from saying that phrase, but especially with Progressive Alliance work. But it really was, with Titus and Stuart, with both excellent questions. But I think we have a winner. Samuel, who's our winner?
I've just seen that Titus has got the highest voted question.
Like the Eurovision Song Contest.
It
is. Yeah. I hope Titus can sing his question. To the tune of "We Don't Talk About Bruno."
Sure enough, Titus has now left the chat. Tonight, Matthew, I shall be Titus. Yeah, go ahead. Ask Titus' question. It was very popular.
The question he raises, is there an issue about the failure of education to enable everyone to learn how the democratic system works, how to take part and have an effective say about issues that concern you? This needs to be participatory learning, as Polly described. And if so, how do we promote it?
Let's put it in the curriculum is like one of the most typical and normal. Everyone wants to put everything in the curriculum. But of course, on this one, Titus is right. You need to think about like what do our schools form as citizens? But the main problem with just chucking it in the curriculum is not teacher workload. It's that if that's your plan, it's even if you just do it really good at 18-year-olds, it's going to take you like 70 years to reach the whole population. And I don't want to wait 70 years, which is why in the end, I think that participatory democracy itself is the educational experience. And it comes back to that opportunity cost point again, right? Is that I learned I was on a jury once. I learned so much from that. I improved my social skills of actually talking to and communicating with other people from really different backgrounds for me. I learned a lot about the economics of the escort trade in London. I lots of things that you wouldn't necessarily want to know, but it was an educative experience for me. And I was a different person emerging from it. Why am I not doing that around local democratic decision making, every couple of years? That's, I think, how you educate people. It's certainly not through a big public information campaign where everybody gets some tedious book about like the copy of the cabinet manual and is expected to read it. I think Titus was sort of on it really, but the participation, but you have to build that through the whole of society and into our workplaces. What workers should be involved in so many more decisions, and in our community centres, and as customers, as citizens, or everywhere. There's so much more that we could do to get involved in decision making if those who have power were to give it away and allow us to participate. And it's not just the decisions would get better, it's that we, the citizens, would change. And that's the public education I think that we need.
100%. And also a wee little plug for our Beyond the Binaries publication, which features a piece by me in which I explain to people, everybody who's very bored by this, one of my favorite films is 12 Angry Men. And like give the analogy with the sitting assembly. It's just 12 white blokes in a room discussing something. It's one of the most powerful, I think, pieces of film art about persuasion and the power of the group dynamic and how people change their views and how people confront their biases and prejudices. And I've seen that in citizen assemblies when I've been a facilitator at quite a few citizen assemblies. I've seen that happen in the room, and it is really exciting, and it really makes you believe in stuff again, and it really uplifts you, and I find it incredibly life affirming. So I'm a huge fan of that, and I want to shout from the rooftops about the potential for it for all of us, because that's really what's going to move our democracies forward. So Polly, thank you so much for being here this evening. We would like to say a huge thank you to everybody on the call for your great questions. I want to give a shout out to Polly's series, and please go and read these papers. They're incredibly readable, entertaining, humorous. I found them a really good read, and not like a policy wonk paper, not like a sort of technocratic policy paper. And I think they include a lot of lines in there which really make you think about the sort of evolution that our democracy needs, but also the work that we can do to convince people about this. Because even though we might think we have fellow travellers, some people are suffering from a lack of democratic faith at the moment. And I think this series of pamphlets really uplifted me in that respect. So a huge thanks to Polly Mackenzie, who's Chief Executive of Demos. A huge thank you to everybody on the call. And also finally, a huge thanks to my colleague Samuel. It was his first time doing the podcast tonight. Big shout out to Samuel for moderating so well. And see you next time on It's Bloody Complicated.
If you like what you heard today and want to be part of building a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast. Plus, you'll be able to join us live on future calls like this one. You can tweet Compass Office or email francis@compassonline.org.uk. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. After all, it's only fair they know it's bloody complicated too.